One thing that has stayed with me from my early years as a parent is the importance of using correct body part names. There's so many issues related to bodies: body image, social media and its influence, self-esteem, uniqueness, self-confidence, self-respect, sexuality, sex and gender. And I found that some kids assumed there was shame or embarrassment about the body parts that some families had other names for.
Just a Sec Education acknowledges the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians and the original educators of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We recognise that this land was never ceded. A few disclaimers before we jump in. This is a sexuality education podcast. For this series, our content will be aimed at parents of 8 to 12-year-olds. Naturally, we'll be talking about bodies, puberty, sex, porn, and other related topics, so please use your judgment when playing it aloud. Hello and welcome to Let's Talk, a podcast by Just a Sec. I'm your host, Fran Folkes-Taylor, and I'm a sexologist, I'm a dietitian, and I'm the founder of Frank Sexology, where I provide sexuality education in Geraldton, Western Australia. Having conversations about sexuality and relationships can be difficult, very difficult, but they are important. In this 6-part series of Let's Talk, we'll be showing you just some examples of how to have these conversations with your kids. We do want to highlight, though, that these chats don't have to be perfect. In fact, they can be very imperfect. And you as a parent or carer can take the parts that are helpful and have these talks in a way that works for your family. In our first episode of this podcast, we will be talking about bodies. We spend our lives in them, yet there is so much confusion and in some cases shame when it comes to understanding and accepting their many parts. And we know that parents and carers can have a big influence on their children in terms of bodies and body acceptance. Today, we will cover the reasons why using the correct terminology for body parts is important and how to talk with your kids about bodies and accepting body differences. So to help us do that today, we have in the studio with us Sam Reed and Annie Fox. Welcome, Sam and Annie.
Thank you.
So Sam is the manager of the Schools, Community and Disability team at Sexual Health Victoria. She is a registered nurse and has over 25 years' experience working in relationships and sexuality education and sexual health. Annie is a parent journalist and the founder of Oonaa, a startup helping parents have important conversations with their children. Welcome, Sam and Annie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to kick things off with a question that we will ask all of our guests at the beginning of the episodes, which is, who is your sex ed hero?
Gosh, well, that is a really hard question to answer because I have just worked with so many incredible people over a long period of time and over a number of different settings and countries. But I'm actually going to go with Anne, who is our content lead at Sexual Health Victoria. She is my sex ed hero because she always centres the voice of children and young people in everything that she does. She always makes sure that everything that we provide to schools is kind, fair, respectful, and is evidence-based, which is so critical to the work that we do, ensuring that the quality of our information is safe and appropriate for young people, and also is really important for parents and carers as well. She absolutely popped into my mind. Yeah.
She sounds wonderful. And what about you, Annie?
Mine would have to be a author-illustrator called Sophie Beard. She creates a series of picture books for children, and one of them that we've had on heavy repeat in our house is Love Makes a Family. It's incredibly representative. It's so beautifully illustrated, and my daughter has loved it ever since she was very, very young. So I would absolutely say that she is my sex ed hero.
Love that. All right, we're going to kick things off. Before I do, though, I just want to say that today and in this podcast series generally, so both myself and our guests will use language such as person with a penis or person with a vulva or vagina, just to be as inclusive as possible. And this is to distinguish that gender and sex aren't the same thing. So let's kick it off. I'll start with you, Sam. What is the difference between gender and sex? Because I know, and myself included in the past, may have used these terms interchangeably.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We do use those terms interchangeably all the time. I'll often say, you only have to think about the way that you fill in a form and you're asked to fill out that form and say, what is your gender?
Yes.
So it happens all of the time, and it's no wonder that can be confusing for children and young people. So a good way that we like to describe the differences between sex and gender is really just in a really clear terms that young people can understand. So we would say when we talk about sex, we are talking about biology. So we are talking about the physical parts of your body that might be inside or outside of your body. And that is relevant for intersex people as well. Yeah. So for example, when a baby is born, it is assigned a sex based usually on their genitals. So the doctor will say penis, boy, vulva, girl. But we know that's not always true for intersex people, for example. When we're describing gender, we would often say that is innately how someone feels about themselves and how they would choose to express themselves within the world. So for a younger person, we can have a number of different ways of explaining that to them. So we can start with things like explaining sex and then build on that to say gender is how you feel about yourself.
That's a brilliant way to explain it. And how's that cropped up in your household, Annie? Has there been any explanations or discussions around sex and gender?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that probably much earlier than I had prepared myself for. I definitely thought it was something that my child wouldn't necessarily be aware of, even though I love to talk and I love to talk to my child. I just didn't. I suppose I underestimated their perception of when they would start to inherently feel a difference between the body they're living in and the way they want to express themselves. I would say that pronouns have really helped us, and so has using different pronouns when we read picture books. So even if there's not a main character, but there's a character on a page, just using a different pronoun to the one that you may assume that particular background character would be subscribed is a really fun way and a really accessible way to just almost present a blank slate around gender and gender identity to your child. So, if we talk about a character in the background, I might use they, and then we'll talk about they. But my child is so open and accepting, which I think children are, and you kind of forget that most of the baggage around gender that you have and the complexity around gender and sex comes from the baggage you carry around as an adult, not necessarily the one you were that you have as a child.
And you mentioned the word intersex, Sam. Are you able to, for our listeners, just to elaborate on that term and what that means?
Yeah, so we know that humans in the world can be born with a variation in their sex characteristics, and we know that is true for about 2% of the population. So it's often not obvious at birth. So a doctor might assign a sex at birth based only on what they see in terms of genitals, but we know that a human might have a variation to those sex characteristics. So it could be based on biology, so reproductive parts that are either outside or inside, or it could be a variation in chromosomes or hormones that might not always be obvious at birth, but might be obvious a bit later on. So it could be something like somebody not starting to menstruate as you might expect, or somebody not starting to go through expected puberty changes in a way that you might expect.
Thank you. And going back to gender, when we talk about the term cisgender and transgender, are you able to, maybe define those as well, just for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. I think it's really important for me to say that labels or language that we use changes all the time, and it's really important to understand what it means for an individual. So whilst I can give an example of what I understand to be transgender or non-binary, that is my interpretation, and the general interpretation, that may change over time. So typically when we describe somebody who is cisgender or cis, that would explain somebody whose assigned gender at birth completely matches with what they understand to be themselves as a human in the world now. So for example, if I'm assigned female at birth, I identify as being a female, then I would describe myself as being a cisgender individual or cis. Alternatively to that, a transgender person or a trans person may describe themselves as, say, for example, I've been assigned female at birth. That actually doesn't fit for me. I know myself to be male, and so therefore I may use a term like transgender to describe myself.
That was very clear, thank you.
Yeah, that was lovely. Thank you.
And what about the term non-binary as well?
Yeah, so somebody who might use the term non-binary to describe themselves may have a variation between cisgender and transgender, for example. So they may feel that they don't neatly fit into an identity of male or female, but may fit somewhere within or outside of that spectrum for them. Again, it's always just really important to talk to the individual about what it means for them. And I can definitely say over my years of working with young people, I've got that wrong.
Yeah.
So
I think we all have at some point,
Yeah, and I've definitely experienced that where I've said, okay, yes, I understand that, so that is this. And they've said, actually, no, that doesn't fit for me at all. So always important to check.
And have these terms come up in your household, Annie?
Yeah, I think the themes have come up, definitely. And I think play is so important because so many things that my child has been curious about, I've been able to watch kind of manifest through how they play with their toys and the conversations they have with their toys. And through that, there's been so many opportunities to explore gender and explore the language and to have her practice or to kind of make a natural part of her discourse with a person or a teddy bear be, do you prefer he, she, or they? And while it maybe as an adult feels like that's such a complicated thing or a heavy thing to ask, a small person to do, it really isn't. And it just feels so natural. And so it definitely has come up, but not as a direct question. And I think that was also something I learned as a parent is that I suppose I thought questions would be more explicit and that I would have like these really formal sit downs with my child who would be like, I would like to know about gender or I would like to know about my body parts. And it just doesn't happen that way. But the questions and the opportunities definitely come up. They just look so different to how I thought they would. Yeah.
So then you have to, take those moments and use them as opportunities to educate and say that information.
And I think just remembering that I have definitely learnt that those conversations aren't linear. Like they don't have a beginning and then a middle and then an end and you're like, whoo, I nailed that gender conversation. Never have to have that again. Tick that box. It's more like it comes up, then they're disinterested because you took 20 minutes to talk about it and now they want to do something else and then it'll come up again later in a different date. And just letting that sort of chaos be really just sort of embracing it, I think has worked for our family, definitely.
I think that's amazing because I think that really helps to reduce things like shame and stigma about conversations because then nothing is a surprise, if you like, when you're having those conversations and they come up naturally and you're able to kind of address them as they come up, which means that it is in an age and stage appropriate way, which is best practice for having all of these conversations all the time. And it's, it's expected and usual for children and young people to want to explore themselves and how they fit in the world. Is this right for me? Do I like this? And they do that all the time. Do I like to play with this toy or that toy? What food do I like to eat? How do I like to express myself? Will I like short hair or long hair? What will I like to wear? What sorts of friends do I want?
Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about body parts and we're going to have a bit of fun with this. So I want our listeners as well to have a brainstorm about all the different terms that they've heard for penis or vulva, vagina, as most people have known it, I guess, growing up.
Oh my gosh.
Doodle.
Doodle is a good
Yeah,
one.
it's a common one.
Doodle or dingle, I don't know.
Dingle, yeah,
like
okay.
that was very much primary school vibes.
Dick.
Oh, that's a good one. Gosh, I'm like totally blanking on them now because I'm just like penis. Don't we all just? Dick is a good one.
I think they tend to be more kind of, it depends on the age of the children, and we definitely do this activity as well in the classroom because we say, get all the words out. What are all the words that you've heard of? And that doesn't actually just apply to really young children. This applies to much older young people as well because they may never have had an opportunity to learn the correct word. And I have to say, I have a friend who really struggles to say the word vulva still to this day. So,
I have lots of friends who suffer from that condition and it's like one of my just like quiet, silent crusades that I'm on is like celebrating the word vulva. And it's really hard. I think it's been so sexualized that people find it hard to say around small people.
Sounds almost explicit, or I don't know, or they've grown up knowing it as a foof or I don't know, I've heard pocket before as a strange one.
Or we just didn't know that they were different.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I was very late in the game when I realised that, the vulva and vagina were two completely different parts of my body. So it's
Yep, that understanding.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, but you need more Dicky Bird
Yeah,
words.
I'm a bit disappointed.
Okay, no, I feel like I can do better at this.
I
I was so sweary in primary school, so I should be better at this.
Yeah, I mean, things like, willy, noodle, dingle.
Oh, she's nailing it.
But even words like Johnny, people using Johnny. Actual names of people to describe their genitals.
That's true.
And what about vulva?
Foo-foo.
Punani, that was
Punani.
That has a very late 90s, early 2000s vibe. I love that. Okay, what else do we call them?
Was one that people used to
muff.
say.
Muff.
Fanny.
Yeah.
Which is also my nickname, which is very unfortunate that I got called all the way through primary school.
My cousin used to call me that, Fanny. I'd hated it. So I guess all jokes aside, why is it important for parents to use correct terminology when it comes to talking about body parts?
Yeah, I think I'd say that the very serious part of this conversation is that it's protective behaviour for young people to know the correct scientific names for their body parts. So it's that they can describe what's happening to them. We play this game heads and shoulders, knees and toes with young people because if they were going to a doctor and they were saying, hey, this is happening to my shoulder, we want them to be able to say what's happening to them, where the pain is. Imagine if they couldn't do that with their genitals. So we want them to be able to say, something feels wrong with my penis. Yeah. Somebody has touched my vulva and it's not my trusted adult. So it's a protective behaviour for sexual abuse. So it's really critical that we teach young people about that really early on.
Yeah. How has that been growing up with your young child? Like using that terminology, how have you gone with that, Annie?
I think I've had a lot of my own personal baggage with sort of childhood trauma and my connection to my own body. So I was really scared.
Yeah.
But exactly for the reasons you just said, it being protective, first and foremost, I wanted that to be true. So I wanted to be able to kind of give that to my child. But also I think in the same way that I would celebrate any sort of capability or any achievement in her body, I would want to be able to do that for every part of her body, right? Like I wouldn't want her to feel like there were areas of her body that were just blank spaces that I could never refer to or never talk to, and that somehow she might inherit that feeling. So I just got over it, and it felt very awkward in the first few instances, but I have to remember that she's never known another word for it. It's never been her noo-noo or her front bum. It's always been her vulva and it's always been her vagina. And so when we have gone to the doctor, she has been able to say the word for it, and there hasn't been any awkwardness, so it doesn't even feel like it is
it's not inherently difficult to say.
No, and it's not
just what we've
inherently
grown up with.
awkward, and the response isn't inherently awkward. So it has. So to that end, I'm really proud that it has been straightforward for her. I think the work definitely happened on the inside with me, and it is a bit of a fake it till you make it. I realise that's probably not a very good parenting strategy, but in total honesty, it's like white sweat inside. It feels weird to say it. Maybe it even sounds a bit weird when I say it first, but then you just sort of do it 100 times, and then you just are like, oh yeah, I'm sort of curing my own baggage at the same time, and you're just like, oh yeah, it's a vulva.
I think it's all about doing your best.
That's true.
You're doing your best. You've got the trust there already with your child, so you're just building on that.
Yeah.
It's, and you're using all the tools that you have available to you. So you're checking in with others, and you're reading those brilliant books that you talked about. So you're absolutely doing all the right things, and it's really
That's so nice. Gosh, you just need to hear that sometimes. Probably not in the middle of this, but I really appreciate that. Thank you.
But it's really usual to feel scared and unsure about these conversations because they are scary. And, I think it helps me to reflect on the fact that, I often say to educators that I work with, I started off in this work as a young person and now I'm a parent and I've gone through that journey, and it's really helped me so much to understand that. And when we talk about things like body parts, I remember going to, my daughter's childcare centre and saying straight away, oh, I'm really sorry to ask this, but what words are you using when you're toileting my child or when you're changing their nappy? And they said, no, don't be sorry, we're using penis and vulva, and I was like, fantastic, because so it's really good to see that this is becoming standard practice. And so what you're saying at home is being reinforced in education settings as well.
That's
great.
great.
Which is really critical.
Yeah.
In terms of vulva, vagina, can we just, for the listeners, clarify if there's any misunderstanding, what is the difference?
Yeah, so the difference is the vulva is the outside skin of the genitals in someone who is typically assigned female at birth. And the vagina is the inside hole part. And then the penis is the external part of some external genital to somebody who is typically assigned male at birth.
Thank you. I should have done it at the beginning, but I thought good to clarify just for everyone's interest. Yep. So I guess we've talked about genitals, we've talked about vulva, vagina, penis, but what about other body parts? So, bottom, breasts, scrotum, clitoris. Yeah, how do we educate our kids about those other body parts?
Yeah, so in the classroom, we would absolutely start with the workbooks and the colouring in sheets, and we would build on those in a way that is age and stage appropriate, but we would start to name what the body parts are. So we would then start to talk about the external genitals as well as the internal reproductive body parts. So we would start to talk about things like testicles and scrotum and what their function is, as well as things like the clitoris, and start to talk about what the function is as well. And as we know, the clitoris is something that has absolutely been left out of the current discourse as well as scientific knowledge. So I can certainly reflect on just a few weeks ago talking to a classroom of Year 7 students, and we were talking about what the clitoris was and what the function was, and I showed them the external view of what you might see, and then we looked at the internal view of the clitoris, which and there was an audible gasp from the classroom, that they'd never seen this view, and it was a really great opportunity to then have this discussion about, well, this is part of sexual pleasure, but it can also, we're now starting to learn, have other functions such as assisting with things like reducing pain. There is some evidence to suggest that it might help in things like fertility. So it actually has an incredible part to play in reproduction as well.
I know, I think I regularly bring out my clitoris model at dinner parties or whenever.
I'll have to have you over.
And Annie, how have you navigated that?
Yeah, I think we've had a lot of breast questions because they're obviously, I have them and they're visible. So my child asked me about breasts and what they're for and why some people have them and some people don't. And I feel like that is quite straightforward. I feel almost like that is of all the body parts, that one was the easy one to kind of get around. I think that for me and other parents I know, one of the things that was probably a bit challenging was trying to talk to our children about the clitoris, particularly because probably around sort of like 4-ish, maybe even a little bit younger for some parents and beyond, touching the clitoris can be part of self-soothing. And so as somebody who's grown up only ever thinking of a clitoris as being very sexual, it was super confronting for me to even name it or even say that it was a clitoris that my child was touching. But I think, again, it was practice and it was just forcing myself in the moment to fake it and just, obviously say that was a clitoris, you're touching your clitoris, and if it feels good, it's totally fine. There's places to do it and etc. And you just do it enough times that eventually, and I think when the reaction is just so not a reaction, you just
Sometimes
kind
you're
of get over
disappointed.
You're just like, oh my God, I did an Olympic level like preparation out in the hallway, and then I came and had this conversation and it was just like,
cool,
not even
I'm
an
gonna go play
eyebrow.
now.
I know. And you're like, oh man, I worked really hard on that delivery. It does. It takes so much pressure off because it's just to them, it's just a part of life. And it's like, okay, cool. Well, I would like to touch it in my room right now. And you're like, okay, cool, I'll get going.
Yeah.
And then you just, and it's so just like, man, imagine growing up like that.
Yeah, amazing.
Gosh.
Yeah.
You're
But
so
I think of the
lucky.
hang-ups, I'm just like, wow.
And how interesting that, when I think about something like the clitoris, that wasn't even included in medical textbooks for professionals to learn.
Till 2005.
Yes.
2005?
Well, that was when it was fully mapped. Yeah.
So they mapped the world many times over, parts of the deep ocean, but just couldn't work out how to map a clitoris.
And yet,
man.
it seems, crazy to me that somehow it's totally acceptable to talk about, for example, touching of the penis in a way that is understood and accepted, but not for the clitoris, for example. And that's backed up by, the fact that it seems to be something that's really sexualized by adults. And has been excluded from medical textbooks, for example. So, no wonder this classroom of year 7s were surprised
Aghast, exactly. That was the word that came to mind.
to see this.
Yeah.
So really important to start to have these conversations, to really start to normalise conversations about body in order to reduce shame and stigma. And for young people to grow up expecting pleasurable interactions with their own bodies and with others that they choose to interact with.
I have a question though. What do we say about bums? Because I still refer to a bum as a bum, and now I'm realising that's not the scientific name for it.
I think it's okay to say bottom.
Okay, bottom.
I think it is okay to say bottom, but also then to start to refer to terminology like anus. And they might say, well, what is the anus? And you can say, okay, well, the anus is where the poo comes out. So just simple language like that can really help.
I believe I've completely left out the anus. Until this moment, it has just never occurred to me to talk about the anus. Thank you.
And in terms of, I guess, our children understanding those body parts and knowing what those body parts are, how do we teach them? Like, do we just use it every day? Do we use books? Like, what's the best way to teach them those parts?
I think all of those things. Yeah, absolutely all of those things, having conversations, and certainly in the work that we do at Sexual Health Victoria is that we really strongly believe in a relationship between home. So the child is centred, and it's a relationship between home, values that come from home, parents and carers, as well as their educational setting, so school, childcare, and the broader community as well. So it's everybody's responsibility. So it's using educational resources, it's having conversations at home that are backed up by school, it's using books, all sorts of things.
And what about if kids, they're all across it, they know the correct terms, you're out in the shopping centre and they're yelling penis or vulva, maybe at times that aren't that appropriate. How do you manage that? Because without shutting them down too much?
I guess one thing that has really helped us in our family around language is sort of talking foundationally about language and how words can have the same power or deserve the same privacy as physical things. And I think sometimes addressing for us and the way that my child has learnt, instead of trying to sort of explain in the moment, sometimes it's much easier to have conversations that kind of underpin those behaviours so that, you know, she understands that certain words require just as much privacy as her physical body does. And what does privacy mean? All of those things about making settings and circumstances appropriate in a way that a child would understand. I think sometimes like social constructs don't really mean anything, and they kind of shouldn't necessarily. But when you think about what a construct is trying to teach you about kindness and respect and choice and safety, those are things that I feel like children can pick up, at least my child can pick up on a little bit more easily. So it's just saying like the shopping centre isn't appropriate to say penis doesn't necessarily feel as easy to understand as, you know, this isn't a private space like the private space at home where we can talk a little differently or where we can show or have more choices about how we present our body. And it's like, oh yeah, okay, cool. I get that.
We as well would use activities to back up that messaging in schools. So we would talk about what's private and what's public in terms of body parts, which is another way to teach protective behaviours. So we would use things like colouring books or colouring pages of bodies and ask children to draw where private body parts are and where public body parts are. We would as well talk about public and private places. So bedrooms might be for touching your own genitals in a private place. You know, that wouldn't be what people would expect you to do in a shopping centre.
The colouring books is a genius idea. Stealing that one.
And Annie, you mentioned before, I guess, that sometimes struggle for parents in getting over their own like discomfort at saying those words. And you said saying it lots of times helped. Are there any other strategies or things that parents can do, parents and carers, to, I guess, overcome that discomfort at the beginning? Say if maybe they're trying to change their language to be more anatomically correct?
Gosh, I think just practicing. Just practicing and even sort of maybe acknowledging to your child that this can, mum or dad or we're feeling a bit funny about saying these words and maybe explaining in age-appropriate language why that's difficult. When I grew up, this was my experience. We used to call it a noodle. Isn't that it? And we would expect them to laugh, laugh together and say, hey, that's a silly word, isn't it? Well, actually, we know that the correct term is penis. And it's really important to know the correct word, and these are the reasons why. So sort of have that open, trusted communication right from the start, I think can really help and go a long way.
And was there anything else that helped you, Annie, other than
I think
saying
other
it?
adults helped me too.
Oh, yeah.
I think just talking to other adults and finding out that they also felt awkward or that maybe they had strategies for it. But also it was just a good place to just say that word a lot. Yeah. So I wouldn't have to be constantly walking around the house saying vulva like a weirdo. You can just do it in conversation with an adult or a partner or a friend or whatever, because it sort of helps you work through, I think, a little bit of your own awkwardness. Yeah.
And in terms of parents and carers, I guess, helping their children to accept and embrace body parts and their body differences, like how would you recommend parents and carers sort of start that process, or how can they support their children?
I think in terms of being a role model, in terms of describing difference, having conversations about the fact that there is difference in the world really early on of all sorts. There are bodies in the world, and to celebrate and embrace those bodies and have conversations, to use stories, to explain your own growing up story. So, for example, when children start to experience puberty, explain what that was like for you, and having those open, trusted conversations as well, I think can go a really long way. Inviting stories from families as well to share, families that stories that exist in communities, and sharing those opportunities as well, I think is great.
I think the library has saved me so many times. I am so impressed with the quality of children's books at the local library, and exploring the library together is obviously great because, you know, my child can make their own choices, but also going there on my own with a specific thing in mind, trying to find a book that has lots of different types of bodies in it, or a story about different bodies, or a story about consent, or a story about body autonomy, and then just sliding them in the bookshelf and just, you know, patiently waiting for the day that, you know, my child will pick it up and ask about it. I think books have absolutely been amazing, and the library's been such a fantastic resource.
And I think in just media generally, like movies and TV shows, there's a lot more diversity on our screens now, which can be great talking points.
Definitely. Like if you know, watch a film together or a show together, you can ask questions as well that can prompt really good discussion. So what did you notice about that person? And it could be a person in a wheelchair, for example, you know, and that's a really good time to have conversations about difference, you know, because and answering questions as they come up, because children are curious about the world and that's how they learn. So just, you know, answering those questions truthfully and honestly as they arise is a really good opportunity.
I think the inverse of that is also true. If there's something on television that doesn't feel like it reflects the values, even though it could be a great show, right? But they might just have a moment where they, you know, they have a dog that they, you know, throw a throwaway name, like they call it what was the other day? It was just something like this is the fat teddy or the fat cat. And everything else about the show was totally fine, but that is not a word that we use in our family. And it would be so easy to not say anything because, you know, nobody asked, you know, it didn't create an issue in the moment. But also sometimes just pausing the telly, even if the conversation hasn't come up, and just having a way that you can talk about the things on the television that sometimes people say, or the way they present bodies, or the way they treat other people's bodies is not how
I think it very much depends on the context as well.
100%.
I think there's very much an embracing in some contexts of the word fat, but more of a descriptive term rather than, you know, historically it has been used in a derogatory term, in a derogatory way. So, yeah, I think that's, great using those moments and the intention behind those words.
Yeah, definitely, because there's a lot of reclaiming of language that has typically been used in the past to, you know, cause harm to other people. So that makes me think of the word queer, for example. You know, that is really being embraced, you know, as a really inclusive term. But for some older people, that is still not an acceptable term for them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I used it the other day. And I think it was a grandparent that said, "Oh, why are you using that term?" I said, "No, it's like it's all encompassing. It's like a very inclusive term," and they found that really interesting and odd. So I think it's wonderful that these terms are being embraced. And going back to children who are born intersex, it's something that a lot of people, you know, even now have never even heard that term. Don't know what it means. And if, say, a parent or carer has a child who's intersex, that could be really, I guess, unknown for them and potentially difficult for them to navigate. How does a child, or how does a parent or carer support their child if they are born intersex?
That is a really tricky question to answer. And I'm absolutely not the expert to answer that, because I feel like it's really important to check in with the intersex community about what that means. But I think for parents and carers is to acknowledge the fear and concern that they may have, and making sure that you provide them with accurate resources. So there's the Intersex Human Rights Association of Australia, which has incredible resources and support for parents and carers, as well as members of the community that can support children. And also finding if they're needing to access medical care, so ensuring that they have access to medical professionals that are really inclusive, because as you're probably aware, you know, there is history of things like non-consensual surgeries on intersex babies and things like that. So it is really critical to make sure that parents and carers have access to the most appropriate resources.
Absolutely, yep. And if they don't feel comfortable with a health professional that they're seeing, I think it's very important to get a second opinion and
Absolutely.
go with someone that understands. And
Yep, absolutely.
Great. So before we move on, are there any final comments about, I guess, bodies before we move on to our sex ed spotlight that you want parents and carers to sort of walk away with when it comes to educating their kids?
I feel like for me the most important messages is to know that it's okay for it to feel uncomfortable, and for it to feel awkward, and that it can be really scary because, as someone who's been working in that space for a long time and as a parent, I too don't always get it right all the time at all. We're always learning all of the time. So to know that that's okay, and to look for resources that are going to help you with that journey. So having conversations with professionals, with the school, with the kinders, the childcare, utilising the library, fantastic resources. In our website at Sexual Health Victoria, we make sure that all of our resources are free and readily available to download, and the parent carer community can use to utilise those resources and adapt them in a way that's most appropriate for their own families.
I guess I have two as well. My first one is definitely self-compassion on the part of the parents and carers. I think it's so important that we remember that we've been kind of conditioned to feel a certain way about bodies and sex, and so we are carrying that with us, and so it is totally natural and normal, as you said, to feel uncomfortable, and that's definitely has been a huge part of my experience, getting over some of that and trying to live with that and be kind to myself about it, because I definitely don't always get it right. And then the second one is kind of embracing and acknowledging your child's capability to sort of experience and process nuances. I think I had a real desire for things to feel really binary and straightforward when I wanted to kind of explain or answer questions from my child, because it's just easier, I think, and less messy. But I've learnt so much from my child purely, and this is probably the biggest lesson, is that she really appreciates and understands nuances, and that there doesn't have to be a single answer for anything, and nor does that answer have to stay the same forever, that actually she has such a capacity for and curiosity for how things evolve and transform and might be different in different settings or for different families. And I think in a desire to keep things less confusing, I probably underestimated that and underappreciated how open children are to that very naturally.
I think that's a really good point. I think I'm constantly impressed by my nieces and nephews in the questions that they ask, and you do realise, they have so much capacity to understand those different layers. And if you do start early, it is sort of building on that previous knowledge, and it doesn't have to be super simple all the time, and you can explain it in little parts.
Yeah, that is so true. I'm just thinking about a time when, we were sort of teaching health professionals and educational professionals how to respond if they misgendered somebody. So, we would typically say things like, acknowledge your mistake, apologise and respectfully move on. And then my child coming home from school that day and saying, oh, Mum, I met this new person at school today. They're really nice, but I got their pronouns wrong. I called them she, and then they said, actually, my pronouns are they, them. And they went, oh, so I just said, oh, sorry, and moved on. And I just thought, wow, how incredible. Just they've got it. They're so smart.
So smart. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you both so much. We're going to do Sex Ed Spotlight now. So this is where our guests help answer a question that's been sent in by a community member from a parent or carer. So, and I want our listeners just to remember that these responses can be tailored to their personal situations. So today's question is from the parent of a 1.5-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl. So the parent says, we believe in naming body parts accurately rather than coming up with cute but incorrect names. I have a bee in my bonnet about this, especially for girls, because vagina and vulva are often referred to wrongly and I don't want that to happen in our family. But at the moment, I've been thinking about when do I talk about which parts? And we have answered aspects of this question, but would there be anything specific to say to this parent?
Well, I think there's opportunities there, as we've said, when you're bathing your child, dressing, changing nappies, toileting, all those sorts of things. It's a really good opportunity to start to model language early on because, as I think you said earlier, the fear and shame around using or, worry about using this language comes from adults.
Yeah.
Where and society where things are often sexualized. That's not the case for really young children. So it's a really good opportunity just to use those early teachable moments in the home, backed up by things like childcare settings as well, to provide that consistent messaging.
Anything to add to that, Annie?
I would say, again, play is such a good opportunity for this. I know that when we play with dolls, that, I'll ask for the ask if so-and-so needs the fake invisible nappy cream for their vulva or whatever. And if you just sort of throw it around like that, it just becomes part of the vocabulary. And so dolls are great. Dolls are really good for that because you get to you're both using the word together for an object that isn't necessarily attached to anyone's bodies. And that can be I know for me, my own sort of trauma and hang-ups and struggles, using that word referring to a doll in the early days was a lot easier than using it referring to my child. So it was good practice, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you both very much, Sam and Annie, for joining us today. Now, where can our listeners find you?
So you can find me at Sexual Health Victoria. We have a website, we have a podcast called Doing It that is centred around some information for parents and carers. All of our resources are available to download, and you can find me on LinkedIn as well.
Excellent, thank you. And Annie?
You can find Oonaa, which is the startup that I'm creating for parents to support them in important conversations with their children. It's OONAA, and you can find me across social media.
Excellent, thank you. And for any resources that we have mentioned today, please go to our show notes. Thank you for joining this episode of Let's Talk. If you enjoy the podcast, please follow and share with your community. You can find us on Instagram at its_justasec or online at itsjustasec.com. I'm Fran, thanks for listening, and remember, it only takes just a sec to start these conversations.